Nathaniel Price's hammer struck the rotting floorboard one final time before it gave way completely, sending him tumbling into darkness. What he discovered in that hidden crypt beneath the abandoned church would silence every neighbor who had mocked his foolish dream. Ancient golden chalices gleamed in his flashlight beam. Jeweled manuscripts lay perfectly preserved, and centuries-old treasures worth $220 million waited in the shadows. But how did a simple carpenter's act of faith uncover the greatest religious treasure hoard in American history? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning mist clung to the crumbling stone walls of St. Augustine's Chapel like a shroud, and Nathaniel Price stood before it with nothing but a toolbox, unwavering determination, and the kind of stubborn hope that his neighbors had long since dismissed as madness. The structure had been abandoned for over 30 years. Its roof partially collapsed, windows shattered, and foundations settling into the marshy ground at an alarming angle. Most people in the small town of Millbrook crossed to the other side of Elm Street, rather than walk past what they'd nicknamed God's junkyard. Nathaniel adjusted his worn leather tool belt and approached the heavy wooden doors, their once rich mahogany now weathered to a sickly gray. At 52 years old, he had spent 3 decades perfecting his craft as a carpenter, but never had he taken on a project quite this ambitious, quite this hopeless. His weathered hands, scarred from countless encounters with stubborn nails and unforgiving wood, trembled slightly as he inserted the old skeleton key the church board had reluctantly provided. The door groaned open with a sound that seemed to echo the building's pain. Sunlight streamed through holes in the roof, illuminating dancing dust particles and revealing the full extent of the devastation within. Pews lay scattered and splintered, their wood dark with moisture damage. The altar had partially collapsed under a fallen beam, and everywhere Nathaniel looked, he saw decay, neglect, and what most would consider irreparable damage. The floorboards sagged dangerously in several places, and the stench of mold and rotting wood filled his nostrils. Behind him, he heard the familiar sound of footsteps on gravel, and turned to see Margaret Sullivan approaching with her usual disapproving expression. Margaret owned the flower shop across the street, and had made herself the unofficial spokesperson for the neighborhood's collective opinion about Nathaniel's latest endeavor. "Still planning to waste your money on this death trap, Nathaniel?" she called out, her voice carrying the kind of false concern that barely masked her genuine annoyance. "My herald says the whole foundation is compromised. Says you'd be better off bulldozing the place and starting fresh." Nathaniel set his toolbox down carefully on one of the few remaining stable floorboards and turned to face her. "Morning, Margaret. Beautiful day to start something new, don't you think?" "New?" Margaret laughed, a sharp sound that echoed off the damaged walls. "There's nothing new about throwing good money after bad. This place has been rotting for 30 years. What makes you think you can succeed where the county, the state, and 3 different contractors have all given up?" The question hung in the air like incense from services long past. Nathaniel had asked himself the same thing countless times since he'd first walked through these doors 6 months ago. He'd been delivering custom cabinets to the rectory next door when Father Miguel had mentioned the church board's latest dilemma. They owned the building, couldn't afford to maintain it, couldn't afford to demolish it, and couldn't find anyone willing to take on the restoration at a price they could manage. "Because sometimes," Nathaniel said, picking up his hammer and testing its weight in his palm, "things that look beyond saving just need someone willing to see past the damage to what they used to be." Margaret snorted and shook her head. "Well, don't come crying to me when you're bankrupt and this place falls down around your ears. The whole town's watching, you know. Watching and waiting for you to admit what everyone already knows, that some things are just too far gone to fix." As Margaret's footsteps retreated down Elm Street, Nathaniel stood alone in the damaged sanctuary and tried to imagine what this place had looked like in its prime. Built in 1873, St. Augustine's had served the community for nearly a century before declining membership and rising maintenance costs forced its closure. The Gothic Revival architecture still showed hints of its former grandeur, even beneath layers of water damage and neglect. The pointed arch windows, though broken, retained their elegant proportions. The ribbed vaulting of the ceiling, where it remained intact, still displayed the craftsmanship of artisans long dead. He pulled out the building plans he'd requested from the county archives and spread them across a makeshift table constructed from sawhorses and plywood. The original blueprints showed a structure far more complex than what remained visible. There had been a bell tower, since removed for safety reasons. There had been additional rooms, now sealed off. Most intriguingly, there were architectural details that didn't match what he could see, suggesting modifications made over the decades. Nathaniel decided to start with the most dangerous elements first. The partially collapsed roof needed immediate attention to prevent further water damage, and several support beams required reinforcement before the remaining structure became completely unstable. He spent the first week just clearing debris, hauling out rotted wood, broken glass, and decades of accumulated garbage that vandals and vagrants had left behind. Word of his project spread quickly through Millbrook's tight-knit community, and by the second week, Nathaniel had acquired an audience of regular observers. Some came out of curiosity, others to place bets on how long he'd last before admitting defeat. Children on their way to school would detour past the church to peer through the broken windows, and teenagers used the project as a backdrop for their social media posts, typically with captions mocking the crazy old man press, trying to raise the dead. Robert Chen, who ran the hardware store downtown, became Nathaniel's reluctant supplier and most vocal critic. Every morning, Nathaniel would arrive at Chen's store before opening time, purchasing materials with the methodical precision of someone working from a carefully planned budget. Chen would ring up each transaction while shaking his head and muttering about money down the drain. "You know, Price," Chen said one morning as he tallied up the cost of roofing materials, "I've been in this business for 22 years. I've seen plenty of restoration projects, plenty of ambitious homeowners who thought they could handle more than they really could. But this is something else entirely." Nathaniel counted out bills from a roll he kept in his shirt pocket. "How so?" "This isn't just ambitious, it's delusional. You're one man trying to do work that would challenge a full construction crew. The structural damage alone would cost more than most people make in 5 years. And that's assuming you could even get the permits approved for this kind of major renovation." End quote. "Sometimes the biggest jobs just need to be broken down into smaller pieces," Nathaniel replied, pocketing his change. "Every board replaced, every beam reinforced, every window repaired. That's progress." Chen handed him the receipt with obvious reluctance. "Progress toward what? Even if you somehow manage to make this place structurally sound, which I seriously doubt, what then? It's not like there's a congregation waiting to move back in. The Catholics built a new church on the other side of town 15 years ago. The Presbyterians have their own building. Who exactly is going to use this place when You're done?" It was a fair question, one that Nathaniel had been avoiding thinking about too deeply. His contract with the church board was simple: restore the building to basic structural integrity, and ownership would transfer to him for the symbolic price of $1. What he did with it after that would be his decision entirely. He'd told people he planned to convert it into workshops for local artisans, maybe a community center, but truthfully, he hadn't thought that far ahead. Something about the building had called to him, something beyond practical considerations or financial sense. By the third week, Nathaniel had managed to patch the worst holes in the roof and install temporary supports for the most compromised beams. The work was exhausting, requiring him to climb dangerous scaffolding, lift heavy materials, and perform delicate repairs in spaces barely accessible to a single person. His hands, already rough from decades of carpentry work, developed new calluses and cuts. His back ached constantly, and he fell into bed each night too tired to do anything but plan the next day's tasks. The mockery from his neighbors had evolved from outright laughter to a kind of grudging fascination. People began timing their daily walks to coincide with Nathaniel's work hours, gathering in small groups across the street to observe his progress and debate whether he was making any real headway. The local newspaper, the Millbrook Gazette, sent a photographer to document what they termed one man's quixotic battle against time and gravity. Father Miguel, whose rectory shared a property line with the abandoned church, became Nathaniel's most frequent visitor. The elderly priest would arrive each afternoon around 3 o'clock, carrying 2 cups of coffee and settling into a folding chair to watch the day's work. Unlike the other observers, Father Miguel never offered criticism or predictions of failure. Instead, he seemed genuinely curious about Nathaniel's methods and progress. "You know," Father Miguel said one afternoon as Nathaniel took a break from replacing floor joists, "I've been thinking about something you said last week, about seeing past the damage to what things used to be." Nathaniel wiped sweat from his forehead and gratefully accepted the offered coffee. "What about it?" "Well, I've been in this parish for 18 years now, and I remember when St. Augustine's was still active. I was just a young priest then, fresh out of seminary, and I used to come here sometimes for their evening services. Beautiful liturgy, wonderful music, and the most dedicated congregation you could imagine." Father Miguel paused, gazing up at the scaffolding where Nathaniel had been working on the damaged ceiling. But even then, even when the pews were full and the community was thriving, there were problems, financial struggles, disagreements about modernization, conflicts between traditional and progressive approaches to worship. From the outside, it looked like a thriving church. From the inside, you could see the cracks forming. "What's your point, Father?" "Maybe the damage you're repairing now isn't the real damage. Maybe the real damage happened years before the roof collapsed, before the windows were broken, before the congregation scattered. Maybe what you're really doing is giving this place a chance to be what it was always meant to be, without all the human complications that brought it down the first time." That evening, as Nathaniel locked up his tools and prepared to head home, Father Miguel's words echoed in his mind. He found himself wondering about the history of St. Augustine's, not just the architectural history documented in the building plans, but the human history. Who had worshipped here? What had their lives been like? What hopes and fears had they brought to these pews? What prayers had they whispered in this sanctuary? The fourth week brought Nathaniel's first major setback. While reinforcing the floor near the altar, his crowbar punched through what appeared to be solid subflooring, revealing a hollow space underneath. When he investigated further, he discovered that a significant portion of the church's foundation had been compromised by groundwater, creating voids that made the entire structure unstable. The repair would require excavation, new concrete work, and potentially months of additional labor. Robert Chen practically gloated when Nathaniel arrived at the hardware store the next morning, looking for supplies to tackle the foundation problem. "I hate to say I told you so, Price, but I told you so. Foundation issues, that's the kiss of death for any restoration project. You're looking at $20,000 minimum to fix that properly, assuming you can even get the permits." "I'll figure something out," Nathaniel said quietly, studying a catalog of concrete mixing equipment. "Figure what out? You're a carpenter, not a foundation specialist. This kind of work requires heavy machinery, specialized knowledge, professional contractors. Face facts, man. This project is beyond your capabilities." Nathaniel closed the catalog and looked directly at Chen. "Maybe so, but I'm not ready to quit yet." That afternoon, instead of working on the church, Nathaniel drove to the county library and spent hours researching foundation repair techniques, soil stabilization methods, and drainage solutions. The librarian, a woman named Patricia Wells, who remembered him from high school, helped him locate technical manuals and engineering resources that explained the proper procedures for addressing structural issues in, quote, historic buildings. "Doing some homework on your church project?" Patricia asked as she processed his stack of reference materials for checkout. "Trying to figure out if I'm crazy or just stubborn," Nathaniel admitted. Patricia smiled. "My grandfather always used to say that the difference between crazy and stubborn was whether you succeeded or not. Same behavior, different outcomes, different labels." Over the weekend, Nathaniel developed a plan for addressing the foundation issues using a combination of traditional techniques and modern materials. It would still be expensive, still require more physical labor than any sane person would attempt alone, but it was technically feasible. More importantly, it was something he could learn to do properly if he was willing to invest the time and effort. Monday morning brought an unexpected visitor. Nathaniel arrived at the church to find a well-dressed woman in her 30s standing beside the damaged entrance, studying the building with obvious professional interest. She introduced herself as Dr. Amanda Richardson, an architectural historian from the State University, and explained that she'd heard about his restoration project through the newspaper coverage. "I hope you don't mind my stopping by unannounced," she said, "but I've been researching historic religious architecture in this region, and St. Augustine's is actually quite significant from a historical Bay perspective." Nathaniel set down his toolbox and gave her his full attention. "Significant how?" "Well, it's one of the best preserved examples of rural Gothic revival architecture in the state, despite its current condition. But more than that, it has an interesting history that most people don't know about. The original congregation was founded by German immigrants in the 1860s, and they brought some very traditional European approaches to church construction and decoration." Dr. Richardson pulled out a tablet and showed him photographs of similar churches in Germany and Austria. "See these architectural details? The stonework patterns, the window configurations, the interior layout? These churches were designed to incorporate hidden spaces, secret chambers that could be used to protect valuable religious artifacts during times of political upheaval." End quote. Hidden spaces? It was common practice in Europe during periods of religious persecution. Churches would build concealed chambers, false walls, underground crypts that could hide sacred objects, important documents, sometimes even people if necessary. When these immigrant communities came to America, they often maintained those architectural traditions. Even though the political circumstances were different, Nathaniel felt a strange tingling sensation at the base of his neck. "Are you suggesting that St. Augustine's might have hidden chambers?" "I'm saying it's architecturally consistent with churches that do, and the timing fits perfectly. This church was built during a period when the Catholic community was still facing significant discrimination and suspicion. It would make sense for them to incorporate traditional protective measures into their design." That afternoon, Nathaniel approached his work with renewed energy and a completely different perspective. Instead of simply repairing obvious damage, he began studying the building structure for inconsistencies, spaces that didn't match the architectural plans, walls that seemed thicker than necessary. Dr. Richardson's visit had planted a seed of possibility that made every measurement, every repair, every removal of damaged material feel like an archaeological expedition. The foundation work proved to be even more challenging than he'd anticipated. The excavation required by hand digging in cramped spaces, carefully removing decades of accumulated soil and debris while supporting the existing structure with temporary braces. The physical demands were brutal, requiring him to work in positions that left his entire body aching. But the work also revealed details about the building's original construction that weren't visible from above. The stone foundation was far more substantial than the building plans suggested, with massive granite blocks that would have required significant resources to quarry and transport in the 1870s. More intriguingly, the layout of the foundation didn't quite match the interior floor plan, suggesting spaces that had been filled in or sealed off over the years. On a Thursday afternoon, in his 6th week of work, while clearing debris from a particularly problematic section of foundation, Nathaniel's shovel struck something that didn't feel like stone or soil. He knelt down and carefully brushed away the dirt, revealing what appeared to be worked wood, old but remarkably well preserved. Further investigation showed that he'd uncovered the edge of what looked like a door, though it was positioned horizontally rather than vertically, as if it were covering an entrance to something below. His heart rate accelerated as he expanded the excavation around his discovery. The wooden surface was definitely a door, reinforced with iron bands, and fitted with a heavy lock mechanism that showed no signs of rust despite being buried for decades. The preservation was so remarkable that the wood still showed traces of its original finish, and the metalwork looked as if it had been crafted yesterday. Nathaniel sat back on his heels and stared at his discovery, mind racing with possibilities. This had to be what Dr. Richardson had been talking about. One of the hidden chambers incorporated into the original design. But why was it buried? When had it been sealed? And most importantly, what might still be inside? He spent the remainder of the afternoon carefully clearing the entire door, revealing its full dimensions and examining the lock mechanism. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, far more sophisticated than anything he would have expected to find in a rural American church from the 1870s. The lock appeared to be European in design, possibly German, and looked like it might still be functional if he could find the right key. That evening, Nathaniel called Dr. Richardson and described his discovery. Her excitement was palpable even over the phone, and she promised to drive down the next day to examine the find in person. She also suggested contacting the State Historical Society and possibly the university's archaeology department, but Nathaniel hesitated to involve too many people until he better understood what he uncovered. Friday morning brought Dr. Richardson along with a colleague, Dr. James Hartford from the archaeology department, and Professor Maria Santos, a specialist in religious history. The three academics spent over an hour examining the buried door, taking measurements, photographs, and detailed notes about its construction and apparent age. "This is absolutely extraordinary," Dr. Richardson said as she knelt beside the excavation. "The preservation is remarkable, and the craftsmanship suggests this was built by master artisans, not local craftsmen learning as they went." Professor Santos nodded in agreement. "The lock mechanism is definitely German, probably manufactured in Bavaria in the mid-1800s. This would have been extremely expensive to import, which suggests that whatever this chamber was designed to protect was considered quite valuable." End quote. Dr. Hartford, who had been quietly examining the surrounding foundation work, looked up from his inspection. "Nathaniel, I have to ask, have you considered the legal implications of what you might find down there? If this chamber contains artifacts or documents of historical significance, there could be questions about ownership, preservation requirements, maybe even federal regulations depending on what's involved." The question caught Nathaniel off guard. In his excitement about the discovery, he hadn't thought beyond the immediate mystery of what lay behind the door. "The property belongs to the church board until I complete the restoration work, then ownership transfers to me. I assumed that would include anything found on the property." "It might," Professor Santos said carefully. "But that would depend on what you find, how significant it is historically, and whether there are any competing claims to ownership. Religious artifacts, especially, can involve complex legal questions about cultural patrimony and institutional rights." End quote. Dr. Richardson stood up and brushed dirt from her knees. "Before we get ahead of ourselves with legal concerns, why don't we focus on the immediate question of how to safely access the chamber? The lock mechanism appears to be intact, which suggests the door hasn't been forced open. Do we know if the original church records mention anything about hidden spaces or secured storage areas?" Nathaniel shook his head. "I've been through all the documentation the church board provided, and there's no mention of anything like this. But the records only go back to 1940, when the parish reorganized after World War II. The earlier records were supposedly destroyed in a fire." "Convenient," Dr. Hartford muttered. "Or possibly intentional. If this chamber was designed to protect sensitive materials, the fewer people who knew about it, the better." The academic team spent the rest of the day documenting the discovery and discussing various approaches to opening the chamber safely. They agreed that forcing the lock would risk damaging both the door and potentially whatever was inside, but finding the original key after more than a century seemed impossible. Dr. Richardson suggested consulting with a specialist in antique locks, while Professor Santos recommended researching the original congregation to see if any families might have preserved documents or artifacts that could provide clues about the chamber's purpose. That weekend, Nathaniel found himself unable to focus on the routine restoration work. Every time he picked up a hammer or measuring tape, his attention drifted to the buried door and the mystery it represented. He'd undertaken this project to save a building, to prove that something damaged could be restored to usefulness and beauty. Now, he was confronted with the possibility that the building might contain secrets far more valuable than anyone had imagined. On Monday morning, Father Miguel arrived for his usual afternoon visit 3 hours early, carrying not just coffee, but also a manila folder, thick with photocopied documents. "I've been doing some research of my own," Father Miguel said, settling into his folding chair beside Nathaniel's work area. "After you called me yesterday about this hidden chamber business, I got curious about St. Augustine's history, the parts that aren't in the official parish records." Nathaniel eagerly accepted the folder and began examining its contents. The documents appeared to be copies of letters, newspaper clippings, and what looked like personal diary entries, all dating from the late 1800s and early 1900s. Where did you find these? I have a friend who works in the diocesan archives downtown. Access to records that don't get included in individual parish files. Some of this information is quite fascinating, and some of it is rather troubling. Father Miguel opened his copy of the documents and pointed to a letter dated September 3, 1884. This is correspondence between the original pastor, Father Wilhelm Brennan, and the bishop in Hartford. Father Brennan is reporting on some kind of conflict within the congregation. Disputes about traditional practices and concerns about outside interference. End quote. Nathaniel read the letter carefully, struggling with the formal language and faded handwriting. The specifics were unclear, but Father Brennan seemed to be dealing with a faction within his congregation that was resistant to changes being mandated by church hierarchy. Changes related to modernization of liturgical practices and elimination of Old World customs. What kind of Old World customs? Nathaniel asked. That's where it gets interesting, Father Miguel said, flipping to another document. This diary entry is from Maria Holstead, who was the church organist from 1875 to 1902. She writes about special services conducted in German, about religious artifacts that had been brought from the homeland for safekeeping, and about growing tensions between the older CREF members who wanted to maintain traditional practices, and younger members who wanted to integrate more fully into American Catholic culture. End quote. A newspaper clipping from 1896 provided additional context. The Millbrook Gazette had reported on a disturbance at St. Augustine's during which certain members of the congregation removed items of religious significance from the sanctuary in protest of new policies being implemented by church leadership. The article was brief and diplomatically worded, but it suggested a serious schism within the parish community. So you think this hidden chamber might be connected to that conflict? Nathaniel asked. It would make sense, Father Miguel said. If there was a faction within the congregation that felt their traditional religious practices and artifacts were being threatened by institutional changes, they might have hidden those materials until the controversy passed. The timing certainly fits with when this chamber would have been sealed. End quote. The implications were staggering. If the chamber contained religious artifacts that had been hidden during a period of congregational conflict in the 1890s, they would likely be of significant historical and possibly monetary value. More importantly, they would represent a previously unknown chapter in the religious history of the region. That afternoon, Nathaniel contacted Dr. Richardson to share Father Miguel's research findings. She was fascinated by the historical context and agreed that it provided a compelling explanation for the chamber's existence. She also had an update on the lock situation. Her colleague at the university had identified a locksmith in Boston who specialized in antique mechanisms and might be able to create a working key based on detailed measurements and photographs. However, Dr. Richardson said, I really think we need to involve the State Historical Society before we go any further. If this chamber contains significant religious artifacts, there are proper procedures for documentation and preservation that need to be followed. Plus, having official oversight would protect you legally if questions arise about ownership or cultural patrimony. Nathaniel understood the wisdom of her suggestion, but something made him hesitate. Perhaps it was the weeks he'd spent working alone, proving wrong everyone who said the project was impossible. Perhaps it was a sense of connection to the original congregation members who had built this hiding place. Or perhaps it was simple curiosity that couldn't wait for bureaucratic processes to unfold. Let me think about it, he said. In the meantime, could your locksmith friend take a look at the photographs and give us an estimate on creating a key? Tuesday brought another unexpected visitor. Nathaniel was working on window frame repairs when a black sedan pulled up in front of the church, and a man in an expensive suit stepped out. He introduced himself as Lawrence Whitman, attorney for the Millbrook Historical Preservation Society, and explained that his organization had received reports about potential archaeological discoveries at the church site. We understand that you've uncovered some kind of sealed chamber or vault, Whitman said, consulting notes on his phone. Our board is concerned about ensuring that any historical artifacts found on this property are properly preserved and made available for scholarly research and public education. Nathaniel felt his stomach tighten. Who told you about the chamber? Information about discoveries of potential historical significance tends to circulate quickly in academic circles, Whitman replied smoothly. Our concern is that important cultural resources might be damaged or lost if they're not handled according to professional archaeological standards. The property is privately owned, Nathaniel said carefully. I have a legal agreement with the current owners regarding the restoration work and eventual ownership transfer. Whitman smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course, and we're not questioning your legal rights to the property itself. However, artifacts of significant historical or cultural value may be subject to different considerations under state and federal preservation laws. We'd simply like to ensure that everyone's interests are protected. After Whitman left, Nathaniel felt deeply unsettled. The lawyer's visit felt more like a threat than an offer of assistance, and the timing seemed suspicious. Someone was obviously monitoring his work and reporting his discoveries to outside parties. The question was, who, and what their ultimate intentions might be. That evening, Nathaniel called Father Miguel to describe the lawyer's visit. The priest listened thoughtfully, then suggested a meeting that could provide some additional perspective on the situation. There's someone I think you should talk to, Father Miguel said. Anna Brennan lives in the assisted living facility on Oak Street. She's 94 years old, sharp as a tack, and she's the great-granddaughter of Father Wilhelm Brennan, the original pastor at St. Augustine's. If anyone knows the real history of that church and what might be hidden there, it would be Anna. Wednesday afternoon found Nathaniel sitting in the sunroom of Millbrook Manor, across from a tiny woman with bright blue eyes and silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Anna Brennan moved slowly, but spoke with the clarity and precision of someone whose mind remained unaffected by the passage of years. Father Miguel tells me you're restoring the old church, she said, studying Nathaniel with obvious interest. And that you found something unexpected in the process. Nathaniel described his discovery of the hidden chamber, the historical research that suggested it might be connected to congregational conflicts in the 1890s, and the recent visit from the Preservation Society lawyer. Anna listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow, but offering no commentary until he finished his entire account. My great-grandfather was a complicated man, Anna said finally. Devout, certainly, and dedicated to his congregation, but also caught between competing demands that sometimes put him in impossible positions. She paused, gazing out the sunroom windows at the afternoon sky. The German Catholic community that founded St. Augustine's brought with them not just their faith, but also their cultural traditions, their language, their ways of understanding and practicing religion. When they came to America, they found themselves in a Catholic church that was dominated by Irish and Italian passion, influences, institutions that sometimes viewed German traditions with suspicion. Anna turned back to Nathaniel. The artifacts you're likely to find in that chamber, they weren't hidden because they were stolen, or because they represented some kind of heretical practice. They were hidden because they represented a way of being Catholic that was being systematically eliminated by church hierarchy, that wanted uniformity and assimilation above cultural preservation. End quote. What kind of artifacts are we talking about? Chalices and reliquaries brought from Bavaria and Austria, illuminated prayer books and missals in German, vestments embroidered by the women of the congregation, sacred art that reflected Germanic rather than Rawl, Roman artistic traditions. Anna's voice grew softer. These were beautiful things, meaningful things, created by devout people to glorify God in their own cultural language. But they represented diversity in an institution that was moving towards standardization. She reached into a side table drawer and pulled out a small wooden box, opening it to reveal an ornate key that looked very old and very European in design. My great-grandfather gave this to my great-grandmother on his deathbed in 1915. He told her it opened the heart of St. Augustine's and that someday, when the time was right, someone would need it to restore what had been lost. Nathaniel stared at the key, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. You think this opens the chamber? I think my great-grandfather spent the last 30 years of his life hoping that someone would come along who understood that preserving beautiful things sometimes requires protecting them from people who don't understand their value. Anna closed the box and handed it to Nathaniel. The Preservation Society lawyer who visited you, he represents people who see dollar signs when they look at historical artifacts. They're not wrong that these objects may be valuable, but their interest is in ownership and control, not in understanding or honoring what these things actually mean." End quote. What do you think I should do? I think you should open that chamber and see what 90 years of patience and faith have preserved. And then you should decide, based on what you find, how to ensure that it serves the purpose for which it was hidden, keeping beautiful, sacred things safe from people who would diminish or exploit them. End quote. That night, Nathaniel lay awake thinking about Anna Brennan's words, about the weight of the key in his jacket pocket, about the responsibility he'd inherited along with this restoration project. When he'd first started working on St. Augustine's, his goal had been simple: prove that a damaged building could be saved, that something dismissed as worthless might still have value. Now, he faced the possibility that he'd uncovered not just a building's hidden history, but a treasure that people might kill for, certainly fight over, and definitely try to control. Thursday morning, Nathaniel arrived at the church before dawn and spent an hour just sitting in the damaged sanctuary, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The building looked different now than it had 7 weeks ago. The roof was solid, the structural supports were secure, and most of the dangerous damage had been repaired. It was still far from beautiful, still obviously a work in progress, but it no longer felt like a ruin. It felt like a place where something important might happen. At 7 o'clock, Father Miguel arrived carrying coffee and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "Anna called me last night after you left," he said. "She told me about the key, about her great-grandfather's message. I've been thinking about this all night, Nathaniel. And I believe we're dealing with something much more significant than anyone realized." "How so?" "How so?" The German Catholic community that built this church, they weren't just immigrants preserving their cultural traditions. Many of them were refugees from the Kulturkampf, the conflict between the German government and the Catholic Church in the 1870s and 80s. They came to America carrying not just personal religious artifacts, but items that had been rescued from churches and monasteries that were being suppressed by Bismarck's government. End quote. Father Miguel sat down on one of the restored pews and continued. If Anna's great-grandfather and his congregation were hiding artifacts brought from Germany during that period, we could be talking about religious treasures that are centuries old, pieces that were created for European churches and monasteries, with resources and artistic traditions far beyond anything that existed in rural America. End quote. The implications were staggering. Nathaniel had been thinking in terms of local historical significance, artifacts important to understanding the immigrant experience in Connecticut. But if Father Miguel was right, the chamber might contain European religious art and artifacts of international significance. "There's something else," Father Miguel said quietly. "I did some additional research yesterday evening, looking into what happened to religious artifacts that were smuggled out of Germany during the Kulturkampf. Some pieces ended up in major American museums and collections, but many simply disappeared into immigrant communities and were never cataloged or documented. Art historians have been speculating for decades about where some of these missing pieces might be. So, at 9 o'clock, Dr. Richardson arrived with her locksmith consultant, an elderly man named Giuseppe Torino, who had driven down from Boston specifically to examine the antique lock mechanism. Torino spent 20 minutes studying the buried door, taking measurements, and comparing the mechanism to photographs in a reference book he brought along. "This is a beautiful piece of work," Torino said, running his fingers along the iron bands that reinforced the door. "German craftsmanship, probably 1860s or 70s. The mechanism is complex but well preserved. I could create a working key, but it would take several weeks and cost probably $3,000. Or," Nathaniel said, pulling out Anna Brennan's wooden box, "we could try the original." Dr. Richardson's eyes widened as Nathaniel revealed the ornate key. Torino examined it carefully, comparing its dimensions and design to the lock mechanism, then nodded with obvious professional satisfaction. "This should work," he said simply. "The wear patterns on the key match the mechanism, And the proportions are exactly right. Whoever made this lock and key, they were real artists. The moment had arrived. Nathaniel knelt beside the buried door, inserted the key into the lock mechanism, and felt it slide into place with a satisfying click. The key turned smoothly, as if it had been used yesterday rather than sealed away for nearly a century. The lock mechanism released with a sound like a deep breath, and the door shifted slightly in its frame. "Careful now," Dr. Richardson cautioned. "We don't know what condition things might be in down there, or how stable the air quality is after being sealed for so long." Father Miguel produced a flashlight from his jacket pocket and handed it to Nathaniel. "The honor should be yours. You're the one who saved this place." Nathaniel's hands trembled slightly as he grasped the iron handle and slowly lifted the heavy wooden door. The hinges, despite their age, moved smoothly and silently, revealing stone steps that descended into darkness. Cool air rushed up from below, carrying scents of old wood, ancient stone, and something else, something that reminded him of the interior of very old churches, the smell of centuries-old incense and sacred spaces. The flashlight beam revealed a narrow stone stairway descending about 8 feet into a carefully constructed chamber. The walls were lined with dressed stone, and the ceiling was supported by Gothic arches that mirrored the architecture of the church above. As Nathaniel's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he could make out shapes arranged along the walls, objects covered in what appeared to be heavy cloth. "My God," Dr. Richardson whispered, peering over Nathaniel's shoulder. "It's a proper crypt, built with the same care and craftsmanship as the church itself." Nathaniel descended the stairs slowly, testing each step for stability. The construction was solid, showing no signs of water damage or structural compromise. The chamber was approximately 12 feet by 15 feet, with a vaulted ceiling that rose to about 7 feet at its highest point. Along the walls, carefully arranged on stone shelves and wooden stands, were dozens of objects draped in heavy canvas covers. Father Miguel followed him down, bringing additional light, and together they approached the nearest covered object. When Nathaniel gently lifted the cloth, both men gasped audibly. Beneath the covering stood a golden chalice of extraordinary beauty, its surface adorned with intricate engravings and set with what appeared to be precious stones. The craftsmanship was beyond anything either man had ever seen outside of a major museum. "Nathaniel," Father Miguel said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I think we need to be very careful about how we proceed from here." They moved systematically through the chamber, carefully lifting covers to examine each object. What they found exceeded even Father Miguel's most optimistic predictions. There were chalices, potens, and ciboria crafted from gold and silver. Illuminated manuscripts bound in leather and decorated with gold leaf and precious stones. Carved wooden statues of saints that showed the distinctive style of German religious art from the medieval period. Embroidered vestments that looked as if they had been created for cathedral ceremonies rather than rural parish services. Most remarkably, everything was in pristine condition. The chamber's construction had created a stable environment that protected the artifacts from moisture, temperature fluctuations, and other environmental factors that typically cause deterioration over time. Dr. Richardson, who had remained above ground to document the discovery, called down from the entrance. "What are you seeing down there?" "Things that are going to change everything we thought we knew about immigrant religious communities in America," Father Miguel called back. "And things that are probably worth more money than this entire town sees in a decade." As they continued their examination, Nathaniel began to understand the full scope of what the original congregation had hidden. These weren't just the religious artifacts of a small German Catholic parish. These were treasures that had been accumulated over centuries, pieces that belonged in the collections of European cathedrals and monasteries. The fact that they had ended up in a rural Connecticut church, carefully hidden and preserved by immigrant families, represented an incredible untold story of cultural preservation and religious devotion. At the far end of the chamber, they discovered something that took their breath away completely. Arranged on a specially constructed altar were 3 objects that clearly represented the most valuable items in the collection. A golden reliquary in the shape of a Gothic cathedral, studded with gems and containing what appeared to be religious relics. A chalice that was clearly medieval in origin, its base decorated with scenes from the life of Christ, rendered in gold and enamel work of museum quality. And most stunning of all, an illuminated gospel book bound in covers of gold and ivory, decorated with precious stones arranged in intricate patterns. "Father," Nathaniel said quietly, "I think we're looking at artifacts that are worth millions of dollars." Father Miguel nodded, his face pale with the magnitude of their discovery. "Probably tens of millions, maybe more. Some of these pieces, if they're authentic examples of medieval European religious art, they're literally priceless." Above them, Dr. Richardson was growing increasingly agitated about being excluded from the initial examination. "I really think we should document everything systematically before we disturb anything else," she called down. "This kind of discovery needs to be handled according to proper archaeological protocols." Nathaniel looked around the chamber one more time, trying to absorb the full impact of what they'd uncovered. Then he climbed back up the stone steps to discuss with Dr. Richardson how to proceed. What he found waiting for him at ground level made his blood run cold. Standing beside Dr. Richardson were Lawrence Whitman, the Preservation Society lawyer, two men in dark suits who looked like government agents, and Margaret Sullivan, his neighbor who had been so vocal in her criticism of the restoration project. "Mr. Price," Whitman said with a smile that was anything but friendly, "I think we need to have a serious conversation about the proper handling of what you've discovered here." "How did you know?" Nathaniel asked, looking directly at Margaret. She had the grace to look embarrassed, but her voice was defiant. "I've been watching this place for weeks, Nathaniel. When I saw all these academic types showing up, when I heard talk about hidden chambers and historical artifacts, I thought the proper authorities should be informed." One of the dark-suited men stepped forward and produced a badge identifying him as Agent David Morrison from the FBI's art crime team. "Mr. Price, we have reason to believe that this site may contain cultural artifacts that were illegally removed from their countries of origin. We're going to need to secure the scene while we conduct a proper investigation." "Illegally removed? Why?" Nathaniel felt anger rising in his chest. "These artifacts have been here for over a century. They were brought by immigrants who were fleeing religious persecution, people who were trying to save sacred objects from destruction." Agent Morrison's expression didn't change. "That may be true, but it doesn't necessarily establish legal ownership under current international laws governing cultural patrimony. Until we can verify the provenance and legal status of these materials, they need to be secured and properly cataloged." End quote. Dr. Richardson looked stricken. "Agent Morrison, I understand your concerns, but this is an active archaeological site. Any removal or examination of artifacts should be conducted according to scientific protocols, with proper COLs, documentation, and preservation procedures. Our crime scene technicians are trained in handling cultural artifacts," Agent Morrison replied. "We'll ensure that everything is properly documented and preserved, but our first priority has to be securing potential evidence and ensuring that nothing leaves the site until questions of ownership and legality are sembe resolved." Nathaniel felt the situation spiraling out of control. 7 weeks of back-breaking labor, of proving wrong everyone who said the project was impossible, of uncovering what might be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in American religious history. And now bureaucrats and lawyers were going to take control of everything. Father Miguel emerged from the chamber, took one look at the assembled officials, and immediately understood what was happening. "Gentlemen," he said with the calm authority that came from decades of dealing with institutional conflicts, "I think there may be some misunderstanding about the legal status of this property and any artifacts found on it." Agent Morrison turned his attention to the priest. "How so, Father?" "The property currently belongs to the St. Augustine Parish Trust, which is a legally incorporated entity under Connecticut state law. Mr. Price is working under contract with the trust, and any discoveries made during his restoration work would fall under the ownership of the contracting entity until such time as the property transfer is completed." End quote. "That may be true for the property itself," Whitman interjected, "but artifacts of significant cultural or historical value may be subject to different legal considerations, particularly if they were originally removed from their countries of origin without proper documentation." And who Father Miguel asked with deceptive mildness. Made the determination that these artifacts were improperly removed from their countries of origin? Have you examined them? Do you have documentation about their history or provenance? Or are you simply making assumptions based on the fact that they're old and valuable? The exchange continued for nearly an hour, with lawyers citing various statutes and regulations, academics arguing about proper procedures, and government agents insisting on their authority to secure potential evidence. Throughout the discussion, Nathaniel found himself thinking about Anna Brennan's words, about her great-grandfather's hope that someday the right person would find the key and restore what had been lost. Finally, Father Miguel proposed a compromise that seemed to satisfy most parties involved. The site would be secured, and the artifacts would remain in place, while proper documentation and authentication procedures were conducted. Dr. Richardson and her academic colleagues would supervise the archaeological aspects, ensuring that everything was properly recorded and preserved. Agent Morrison's team would conduct whatever investigations were necessary to verify legal ownership and provenance. And Nathaniel would continue his restoration work on the church building itself, though the chamber area would be off limits until all legal questions were resolved. It wasn't the outcome Nathaniel had hoped for, but it was better than having everything immediately confiscated by federal agents. More importantly, it meant that the artifacts would be properly studied and documented, ensuring that their historical significance would be recognized and preserved. Over the following weeks, St. Augustine's became the center of intense activity as teams of experts descended on the small town to examine what the media had begun calling the Millbrook treasure. Archaeological technicians carefully cataloged every item in the chamber. Art historians compared the pieces to known examples of European religious art. FBI investigators researched the immigration records of the original German Catholic families who had founded the church. The preliminary assessments were staggering. Conservative estimates placed the total value of the collection at over $200 million. Several pieces were identified as genuine medieval artifacts that had been missing from European collections for over a century. The illuminated Gospel book alone was valued at $30 million, making it one of the most valuable religious manuscripts ever discovered in America. More important than the monetary value, however, was the historical significance of the find. The collection provided unprecedented insight into the religious and cultural traditions that European immigrants had brought to America, traditions that had often been lost or suppressed in the process of assimilation. Scholars from around the world requested access to study pieces that filled gaps in the historical record of European religious art. The legal questions proved more complex than anyone had anticipated. While the FBI's investigation found no evidence that the artifacts had been illegally exported from Germany, the German government filed a formal claim requesting the return of items they considered part of their cultural heritage. The Vatican also expressed interest in pieces that may have originally belonged to Catholic institutions in Europe. Throughout the legal proceedings, Nathaniel continued his restoration work on the church building. The discovery of the treasure had brought unexpected funding, as private donors and grant organizations provided resources to complete the renovation properly. What had started as a one-man project to save a derelict building had become a professionally managed restoration of a site recognized as historically significant. The work took on new meaning as well. Knowing that the building had been designed specifically to protect irreplaceable cultural treasures, every repair felt like an act of historical preservation. The craftsmen who had built St. Augustine's in the 1870s had created not just a place of worship, but a fortress designed to safeguard the most precious possessions of their community. 8 months after Nathaniel had first inserted Anna Brennan's key into the ancient lock, the legal questions were finally resolved through a complex agreement that satisfied most of the competing interests. The artifacts would remain in America, but under the joint custody of several institutions. The most valuable pieces would be displayed in major museums, ensuring that they would be accessible to scholars and the public. Lesser items would be housed in a new museum to be constructed adjacent to St. Augustine's, creating a permanent center for the study of German-American religious history. Nathaniel's role in the discovery was formally recognized through several mechanisms. He received a finder's fee that amounted to 10% of the collection's appraised value, making him a wealthy man overnight. More importantly, he was appointed as the director of the new museum, and given responsibility for overseeing the ongoing preservation of the site. The restored St. Augustine's Chapel was rededicated in a ceremony attended by officials from the German government, representatives from the Vatican, and scholars from around the world. The building that had once been dismissed as God's junkyard was now recognized as one of the most significant sites in American religious history. During the dedication ceremony, Father Miguel offered a reflection on the meaning of the discovery that had transformed not just the building, but the entire community's understanding of their heritage. 700 years ago, he said, addressing the crowd that filled the restored sanctuary, craftsmen in Bavaria created beautiful objects to glorify God and serve their community's spiritual needs. 500 years ago, monks and priests preserved these treasures through wars and political upheavals. 150 years ago, immigrants carried them across an ocean to a new country where they hoped to practice their faith in freedom. 100 years ago, a wise pastor and his congregation hid these precious things when they felt their traditions were threatened. Father Miguel paused, looking around the sanctuary, where sunlight now streamed through restored stained glass windows, illuminating pews filled with people from around the world who had come to witness this moment. And 8 months ago, a carpenter who understood that broken things can be made beautiful again, uncovered what patience and faith had preserved. This building, these artifacts, this community story, they all teach us the same lesson: that things of genuine value endure, even when they seem lost, even when others dismiss them as worthless. Nathaniel, sitting in the front row beside Anna Brennan, who had lived to see her great-grandfather's prophecy fulfilled, felt a deep sense of completion. The project that had begun as a simple desire to save a damaged building had uncovered treasures beyond anything he could have imagined. But the real treasure, he realized, wasn't the gold and jewels and priceless manuscripts. The real treasure was the understanding that faith, patience, and the willingness to see value where others saw only ruin could preserve the most important things through even the darkest times. The German immigrants who had built St. Augustine's Chapel had been wiser than anyone knew. They had created not just a hiding place for valuable objects, but a monument to the belief that beautiful, sacred things deserve to be protected, preserved, and eventually shared with the world. As the ceremony concluded and guests began to tour the restored building and the new museum, Nathaniel walked through the sanctuary one more time. Remembering how it had looked that first morning when he'd stood among the ruins with nothing but a toolbox and an inexplicable conviction that something worth saving lay hidden beneath the damage. Margaret Sullivan, who had become one of the museum's most enthusiastic volunteers, approached him with a somewhat sheepish expression. "Nathaniel, I owe you an apology. When you started this project, I thought you were completely crazy. I never imagined that something so amazing was hidden here all along." Nathaniel smiled, thinking about all the people who had doubted the project, who had called it a waste of time and money, who had been certain that some things were simply too damaged to be worth saving. "Sometimes, Margaret, the most valuable things are hidden in the most unlikely places. You just have to be willing to look past the surface damage to see what's really there." The sun was setting through the restored stained glass windows, casting colored light across the wooden pews that Nathaniel had repaired with his own hands. In the museum next door, visitors were examining artifacts that had been hidden for a century, treasures that told the story of faith, sacrifice, and the determination to preserve beautiful things for future generations. Outside, the building that had once been known as God's junkyard stood as a testament to the possibility of redemption, proof that with enough patience, faith, and hard work, even the most damaged things could be restored to all glory. The treasure worth $220 million had made headlines around the world, but Nathaniel knew that the real miracle was simpler and more profound. Sometimes, when you're willing to see value where others see only ruin, you discover that broken things can indeed be made beautiful again. The story of St. Augustine's Chapel would be told for generations, but for Nathaniel, the most important part wasn't the discovery of priceless artifacts or the international recognition that followed. The most important part was the moment when he'd first walked into that damaged sanctuary and decided that something dismissed as worthless might still be worth saving. In the end, that decision had revealed treasures beyond imagination, but more importantly, it had proven that faith in the possibility of restoration whether of buildings or communities or human hearts, was never cameral, misplaced. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning, Nathaniel stood in his new office, overlooking the museum courtyard, where visitors from around the world gathered daily to hear the story of the Millbrook treasure. The transformed landscape bore no resemblance to the desolate scene he had first encountered. Where once there had been crumbling stone and broken glass, now there were carefully manicured gardens, educational pavilions, and walkways that guided thousands of annual visitors through the site where faith had preserved irreplaceable treasures. The success of the museum had transformed not just the property, but the entire town of Millbrook. Property values had soared as the community became a destination for religious pilgrims, art historians, and tourists fascinated by the story of hidden treasure. Local businesses that had struggled for years now thrived, supported by the steady stream of visitors who came to see the artifacts and hear the remarkable tale of their discovery. But the changes went deeper than economic prosperity. The discovery had forced the community to reconsider its own history, to recognize that their small town had been home to one of the most significant archaeological finds in American religious history. Children who had grown up hearing stories about crazy Nathaniel and his impossible church project now studied the discovery in school as an example of how individual determination could uncover hidden chapters of American immigrant history. Dr. Richardson, who had become the museum's chief curator, often told visitors that the Millbrook treasure represented more than just valuable artifacts. It demonstrated how immigrant communities had managed to preserve their cultural heritage, even under pressure to assimilate, how ordinary people had made extraordinary sacrifices to protect things they considered sacred, and how patience and careful stewardship could preserve treasures for future generations who would better understand their significance. The academic impact of the discovery continued to ripple outward as scholars published research based on their examination of the artifacts. The illuminated manuscripts provided new insights into medieval European religious practices. The chalices and reliquaries revealed information about metalworking techniques and artistic traditions that had been lost for centuries. Most significantly, the entire collection offered unprecedented documentation of the cultural and spiritual life of German Catholic immigrants in 19th-century America. Giuseppe Torino, the locksmith who had confirmed that Anna Brennan's key would open the ancient chamber, had become something of a celebrity in antique restoration circles. Museums and collectors from around the world sought his expertise in dealing with historical lock mechanisms, and he credited his experience at St. Augustine's with reviving interest in the specialized craft of historical metalwork restoration. He had established a workshop in Millbrook, where he trained apprentices in traditional techniques, ensuring that the knowledge needed to maintain and restore such mechanisms would not be lost to future generations. Anna Brennan, now 95, had lived to see her great-grandfather's prophecy fulfilled beyond anything he could have imagined. The key she had preserved for 8 decades had unlocked not just a hidden chamber, but an entirely new understanding of her family's history and their community's heritage. She spent her remaining years as the museum's most treasured volunteer, sharing stories about the original German Catholic families who had founded St. Augustine's, and explaining to visitors the courage it had taken for immigrants to preserve their cultural traditions in a new and sometimes hostile environment. The legal resolution of ownership questions had established important precedents for similar discoveries. The agreement that allowed the artifacts to remain in America while acknowledging their European origins created a framework for handling cultural patrimony disputes that respected both historical connections and current realities. Legal scholars studying the case noted that it demonstrated how competing claims to cultural heritage could be resolved through cooperation rather than litigation, creating outcomes that served education and preservation rather than narrow institutional interests. Father Miguel had used his experience with the discovery to write a book about the intersection of faith, history, and cultural preservation. His work, titled Hidden Treasures: How Ordinary Faith Preserves Extraordinary Grace, became a bestseller in religious and historical circles. He argued that the St. Augustine's discovery illustrated how divine providence often worked through human dedication and patience. How God used people's willingness to preserve and protect sacred things to ensure that they would be available when the world was ready to appreciate their true value. The book tour took Father Miguel around the country, speaking to congregations and academic audiences about the lessons that could be learned from the Millbrook treasure. He emphasized that while not every restoration project would uncover priceless artifacts, every act of faithful stewardship contributed to preserving something valuable for future generations. Whether people were restoring buildings, maintaining family traditions, or simply refusing to give up on damaged relationships, they were participating in the same kind of patient faith that had preserved the St. Augustine's treasure for over a century. Robert Chen, the hardware store owner who had been Nathaniel's most persistent critic, had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of anyone in the community. The man who had daily predicted failure and bankruptcy for the church restoration project now served as president of the Millbrook Historical Preservation Society, the same organization whose lawyer had initially tried to seize control of the discovery. Chen had publicly apologized to Nathaniel for his lack of faith in the project and had become one of the museum's most generous financial supporters. More importantly, Chen had learned to see potential where he had previously seen only problems. His hardware store now carried specialty items for historical restoration projects, and he had become an expert in traditional building techniques and materials. He regularly consulted with preservationists working on historical buildings throughout the region, sharing knowledge he had gained by watching Nathaniel's meticulous approach to repairing damaged structures without, quote, losing their original character. The transformation extended beyond individual community members to the broader culture of Millbrook itself. The town that had once mocked ambitious projects and dismissed anything that seemed too difficult or expensive now celebrated innovation and supported community members who undertook challenging endeavors. The elementary school established an annual Nathaniel Price Award for students who demonstrated persistence in pursuing difficult goals, and the town council created grants to help residents undertake historical preservation projects on their own properties. Margaret Sullivan, who had once led the neighborhood criticism of Nathaniel's work, had become the museum's volunteer coordinator and one of its most effective fundraisers. She organized annual benefit events that brought together community members and visitors from around the world, creating an ongoing source of support for the museum's educational programs and preservation activities. Her experience of being wrong about the church project had taught her to be more supportive of community members who undertook ambitious goals, and she had become known for encouraging rather than discouraging bold initiatives. The success of the St. Augustine's restoration had inspired similar projects throughout the region. Historical societies in neighboring towns began surveying abandoned or deteriorating religious buildings, wondering what secrets might be hidden beneath decades of neglect. While no other discoveries approached the magnitude of the Millbrook treasure, several communities uncovered important artifacts and documents that added to the historical record of immigrant religious communities in New Beatty, England. Dr. James Hartford, the archaeologist who had helped document the initial discovery, established a research center at the State University focused on studying immigrant religious communities and their material culture. The center used the St. Augustine's collection as a foundation for broader research into how different ethnic and religious groups had preserved their cultural heritage while adapting to American society. Graduate students came from around the world to study the artifacts and contribute to ongoing research about European religious art and its preservation in American immigrant communities. The financial impact of Nathaniel's finder's fee had allowed him to establish the Price Foundation for Historical Preservation, which provided grants and technical assistance to individuals and communities undertaking restoration projects on historically significant buildings. The foundation's motto, "Seeing value where others see ruin," reflected Nathaniel's belief that many important historical sites were being lost simply because no one was willing to invest the time and effort needed to restore them properly. Foundation grants had supported restoration projects in dozens of communities, helping to preserve covered bridges, historic homes, abandoned mills, and religious buildings that might otherwise have been demolished or allowed to deteriorate beyond repair. Each project created jobs, preserved historical knowledge, and demonstrated that communities could take responsibility for maintaining their own cultural heritage rather than waiting for government, agencies, or large institutions to act. The educational impact of the discovery extended far beyond the museum itself. The story of the St. Augustine's treasure had been incorporated into curricula at schools and universities across the country as an example of how archaeological discoveries could illuminate previously unknown aspects of American history. Students studied the case to understand how immigrant communities had navigated between preserving their cultural traditions and adapting to their new environment, and how individual acts of faith and patience could preserve irreplaceable cultural resources. International scholars had established an exchange program that brought European researchers to study the American context of the MR artifacts while sending American students to Europe to study the original cultural and religious traditions that had produced the treasures. The program created ongoing relationships between institutions on both sides of the Atlantic, fostering collaborative research and cultural understanding that honored both the European origins of the NDD artifacts and their American preservation. 10 years after that first morning, when Nathaniel had stood before the crumbling facade of St. Augustine's Chapel with nothing but a toolbox and stubborn hope, the site hosted an anniversary celebration that brought together everyone who had played a role in the discovery and preservation of the treasure. Government officials who had initially tried to seize the artifacts now praised the collaborative approach that had kept them accessible for research and education. Scholars who had studied the pieces shared insights about medieval European religious practices that had been preserved in ways previously unknown to academic research. Anna Brennan, now 104 years old and still sharp despite her advanced age, served as the guest of honor at the anniversary celebration. In her brief remarks, she reflected on her great-grandfather's faith that someone would eventually come along who understood the value of what had been hidden and preserved. Father Wilhelm told my great-grandmother that these treasures were waiting for the right person, someone who would see past the surface damage to recognize what was really there, she said, her voice still clear despite her age. I think he would be amazed to see not just that the right person came along, but that the discovery brought together so many people from so many places, all working together to preserve and share these beautiful things. Nathaniel, now recognized internationally as an expert in historical preservation and restoration, used his anniversary remarks to reflect on how the project had changed, not just his own life, but his understanding of how individual actions could have far-reaching consequences. When I started working on this building, my goal was simple: prove that something everyone considered worthless might still have value, he said, addressing the crowd gathered in the restored sanctuary. I never imagined that fixing rotted floorboards and patching holes in the roof would lead to discovering treasures that would change how we understand American immigrant history, or that a small-town construction project would bring together people from around the world." End quote. He paused, looking around the sanctuary where afternoon sunlight streamed through stained glass windows that had been restored to their original beauty, illuminating faces of people whose lives had been touched by the discovery in ways both large and small. "But I've learned that this is how important things happen. Not through grand gestures or dramatic announcements, but through ordinary people doing patient, careful work, day after day, because they believe that something valuable is worth preserving even when others can't see its potential. The real treasure here isn't the gold and jewels and ancient manuscripts, magnificent as they are. The real treasure is the demonstration that faith, patience, and hard work can uncover wonders that have been waiting for the right moment to be revealed." End quote. As the anniversary celebration concluded and visitors began to make their way through the museum and restored church, Nathaniel walked once more through the sanctuary where it had all begun. The building bore no resemblance to the ruin he had first encountered, but he could still remember exactly how it had looked that morning when he had decided that something dismissed by everyone else as beyond saving might still be worth the effort to restore. The decision to undertake that seemingly impossible project had revealed treasures beyond anything he could have imagined. But more importantly, it had demonstrated that broken things could indeed be made beautiful again, that patience and faith could preserve wonders through even the darkest times, and that sometimes the most valuable discoveries were hidden in the most unlikely places. waiting for someone willing to look past the surface damage to see what was really there.